The war was almost over, but it wasn't finished breaking people. Cold fog crawled over the broken fields of Western Germany, clinging to shattered fences and burned-out farmhouses like a second skin. The air tasted of wet ash and the metallic ghost of gunfire. In the distance, a crooked barn leaned against the pale sky, its roof sagging like an exhausted chest, struggling to breathe. Inside that barn, 200 German soldiers waited. Except they weren't really soldiers. They were boys, 14, 15, maybe 16 at most, starving, shaking, raised on lies, and now trapped inside them. They had been told that when the Americans came, they would be tortured, beaten, shot without mercy. They expected death. What they didn't expect was kindness. This is the story of 200 German boys who braced for the worst their enemy could do and instead discovered the most powerful weapon of all, mercy. The barn smelled of damp straw, old milk, and fear. Rainwater slipped through gaps in the roof, falling in slow, icy drops that pattered into a rusted milk pail. Each drip echoed like a ticking clock, counting down to a future none of them could see. 200 boys huddled together in the half-dark. Their uniforms were too big, stiff with mud and sweat. Their cheeks were hollowed out by hunger. Their hands trembled, not just from cold, but from an ache that had moved beyond their stomachs and into their bones. In the middle of it all sat Lucas. He was 15, though his small frame and narrow shoulders made him look younger. He clutched a tiny wooden horse in both hands, its paint chipped, its tail missing. It was the last piece of home he had. He could still hear his mother's voice the day he left. Be brave, be loyal. Don't shame us, Lucas. He had tried to be all three, but now, sitting in the collapsing barn, with 200 boys who smelled like fear and rain, he wasn't sure what any of those words meant anymore. From somewhere in the straw, a voice whispered, "Sind sie kommen? Are they coming?" Another answered, low and resigned, "Amerikaner, today or tomorrow." They had marched there 2 days earlier, through fields that no longer looked like a country, but like a wound spreading slowly across the earth. Charred trees clawed at the grey sky. Houses lay in heaps of stone and wood. Dead cattle rotted by the roadside. The Reich, the eternal empire they had been promised as children, was collapsing in real time around them. And still, their officers shouted the same familiar lines, "Fight to the last bullet! Never surrender. The Americans will torture you if they catch you." The boys believed it. What else did they have? On that march, rumors ran through their ranks like infection. They beat you with rifle butts until your bones break. They cut off ears and fingers. They starve you until you betray your country. One boy whispered that the Americans had electric chairs ready for them. Lucas didn't even know what an electric chair looked like, but the terror in the boy's voice was enough to make his stomach twist. That night, in the barn, they slept without blankets, some without shoes, without food, without hope. They fully expected that when the Americans arrived, it would be as monster. The morning of the second day arrived with a cold mist and the sound of distant engines. The boys heard them before they saw anything. The rumble of trucks, the crunch of boots on frozen mud, the distant clatter of metal. Lucas tightened his grip on the wooden horse until his knuckles turned white. This is it, he thought. This is where they make us pay. The barn doors rattled once, twice. Then, with a splintering crack, they swung open, and daylight slammed into the darkness like a shell burst. The boys flinched. Some threw their hands over their faces, some dropped to their knees, others simply stared, eyes wide, waiting for the first blow. But the blows didn't come. Instead, the Americans froze. In the doorway stood a squad of US soldiers, uniforms damp, faces exhausted, rifles pointed, but slowly lowering. At their head was Sergeant Daniel Carter, 28 years old, from Kansas. He had seen beaches soaked in blood. He had seen cities reduced to rubble. He had seen men die in trenches, fields, and hospital tents. But he had never seen anything like this. 200 boys, thin as scarecrows, eyes huge and hollow. For a moment, it didn't look like an enemy force. It looked like a forgotten orphanage. Carter's breath caught in his throat. "My God," he muttered, "they're just kids." Private Jenkins, standing beside him, swallowed hard. His grip on his rifle loosened. "Jesus," he whispered under his breath. "They told us these were hardened fanatics." He stared at the nearest boy, whose collar kept slipping off one sharp shoulder. Looks like he couldn't even lift a rifle. The German boys saw their lips move, but not their thoughts. All they knew was that the enemy now stood inside their world. One boy in the corner, Tobias, barely 14, saw an American step forward and simply collapsed, fainting from a mixture of fear and hunger. An American medic dropped to his knees beside him without waiting for an order. That was the first shock. Not a shouted curse, not a kick, not the crack of a rifle, but a medic gently turning the boy's head, checking his pulse, speaking in calm English he couldn't understand.
Sergeant Carter raised both hands. He tried to remember fragments of German he'd picked up since landing in Europe.
"Wir tun euch nichts," he said slowly. "Wir tun euch nichts."
"We won't hurt you." His accent was heavy. The grammar was wrong, but the tone carried more meaning than the words. A wave of confusion rippled through the barn. The boys had braced for hatred. Instead, they were met with hesitation, with eyes that looked at them not as animals, but as something uncomfortably close to human. The Americans did something that, for the boys, was almost more terrifying than any beating would have been. They stepped back outside and set up a field kitchen. Carter gave the order, his voice flat but firm. "We're feeding them." Jenkins looked at him. 200 of them, Sarge?" Carter didn't hesitate. "We're feeding them," he repeated. "They're prisoners now. That makes them our responsibility." Behind the barn, a stove roared to life. American rations, canned meat, potatoes, onions were dumped into battered pots. Soon, a smell drifted through the broken barn walls, a smell some of the boys hadn't encountered since before the worst bombing began. Stew. Real stew. Thick, hot, fragrant. The scent of browning onions, simmering meat, and soft potatoes rolled over the straw like a ghost from another lifetime. Inside, stomachs clenched and growled. Some boys began to cry silently. Lucas closed his eyes, breathing in slowly, as if the smell alone could keep him alive. He could almost hear his mother's wooden spoon tapping against a pot. He could almost see her turning, smiling, saying, "It's ready." Now he was sure this had to be a trick. The Americans brought in water first. Metal buckets, canteens, tin cups. They moved down the line, cautious but calm. When a cup of water was held in front of him, Lucas's hands shook so violently he spilled half of it onto his coat. "I'm sorry," he blurted in German, as if apologizing might save him from punishment. Sergeant Carter was the one who'd handed him the cup. He gently steadied Lucas's hands. "Langsam," he said softly. "Slow." Lucas stared at him, heart pounding. He had prepared himself for blows, for insults, for the hatred he'd been told was inevitable. Instead, he found something worse. He found kindness. The boys drank, many of them too fast, coughing, choking, their bodies reacting to sudden relief. Then came the stew. The Americans lined them up as best they could, handing out battered metal bowls, ladling in thick portions with practical efficiency. At first the boys ate slowly, unsure if this might be taken away. Then hunger overruled caution. They devoured the food desperately. Some licked the inside of their bowls, eyes closed, tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt on their faces. One prisoner, Otto, stared at his empty bowl, then at the American ladle, then back at the bowl again. His voice cracked as he whispered, "I used to feed my dog better than this, and I thought he was the lucky one." No one laughed. Even the American soldiers looked away, as if embarrassed by how much they still had in their own mess kits. Over the next hours, the barn transformed in subtle ways. Fear loosened its grip, if only by a fraction. Hunger's sharpest edge dulled. Confusion grew, heavy and undeniable.
The boys began to murmur among themselves.
This is just to make us talk. They want us to trust them. It's still a trick. But others whispered things that felt forbidden. They are not what we were told. They look at us as people. The next morning, the Americans brought something the boys didn't expect at all. Not weapons, not chains. Soap. White bars. Heavy, solid, smelling faintly of something floral, lavender maybe. Lucas held his bar like it was made of glass. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the smoothness beneath his dirty fingers. He had almost forgotten what clean felt like. That night, he wrote on a scrap of paper he'd hidden inside his jacket. I did not know soap could have a smell. I did not know my own skin could feel like it belongs to me again. I did not know an enemy could look at me without hatred in his eyes. The Americans set up a small radio outside the barn. At first it was just for them, a taste of home in a foreign ruin. Big band swing poured through the cracked windows, brassy horns, piano, drums, voices singing in a language most of the boys didn't understand, but whose joy cut through anyway. Inside the barn, some boys flinched. The music felt like an insult, proof that somewhere life went on while their world lay in pieces. Others closed their eyes and let the sound carry them. For a moment, they weren't soldiers. They were just boys again, listening to a future they might never see. That evening, Sergeant Carter found Lucas sitting alone behind the barn, knees pulled against his chest, the wooden horse resting between his palms. Lucas wiped at his eyes quickly when he heard footsteps. He didn't want to cry in front of the enemy. Carter sat down beside him without a word. They stayed like that for a moment, watching the fog drift over broken fields. Finally, Lucas spoke. Warum? His voice was soft, raspy. Why? He struggled through his limited English. Why are you kind to us? Carter was quiet for a long time. He thought of his little sister back in Kansas. He thought of the dead German soldiers he'd seen, faces twisted in the mud. He thought of how tired he was of hating people he'd never met before this war. Because you're someone's sons, he said gently, and this war has taken enough from all of us. Lucas frowned, eyes stinging. He had no defense against that answer. Kindness cut deeper than cruelty ever could. Cruelty would have confirmed everything he'd been taught. But kindness exposed the lies. In the days that followed, letters began to arrive. The front was collapsing on all sides. Chaos ruled the roads. But somehow, some of those letters found their way to the barn. One boy, Friedrich, opened a crumpled envelope with shaking hands. Inside, his brother's handwriting told him everything. Their home was gone, their mother missing, their father presumed dead. Friedrich's knees buckled. He sank to the straw-covered floor, the letter crumpling in his fist. Carter knelt beside him. Friedrich stared at the American's face through a haze of tears. "Why?" he whispered. "Why do you treat me better than my own country ever did?" Carter didn't have an answer. Because how do you explain that war can make monsters out of leaders, but not always out of soldiers? How do you explain that sometimes your enemies are the only ones who remember your humanity, because your own side forgot it long ago? Inside the barn, the boys argued. Some insisted, "It's all manipulation. They want us to talk. They want us to betray our country." Others, quieter, whispered, "If they wanted us dead, we'd be dead already. If they wanted us to suffer, they wouldn't give us food, or soap, or music." One night, under the dim light filtering through the cracks, Lucas wrote again on his scrap of paper. "Every day I feel something breaking inside me, not from hunger, not from fear, from them, from the Americans. They talk to us like we are human. They share cigarettes, laugh about things we don't understand, help the sick. If they were monsters, I could hate them. If they beat us, I could endure it. But this is unbearable. How do you fight an enemy who refuses to be your enemy?" On the 7th morning, the order came down. The boys were to be moved. From the makeshift shelter of the barn to a formal camp, a place with proper registration, barbed wire and routines. Safe, fed, documented.
held until the war decided what to do with them. Lucas felt a tightness in his chest that he didn't know how to name. He should have been relieved. A camp meant stability, predictability, a known fate. But the barn, this strange, fragile pocket of humanity in the ruins of a collapsing world, it had become something else, something like proof that the world was not exactly as he'd been told. As the boys lined up to leave, Carter approached Lucas with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Für dich," he said quietly. "For you." Lucas unwrapped it with careful fingers. Inside was another wooden horse, carved from a piece of the barn itself, rough but proud, with a little notch in its side where the knife had slipped. For a second, Lucas couldn't see. His eyes flooded too quickly. He clutched both horses, the broken one from home and the new one from the enemy, against his chest. "Danke," he managed. "Thank you." Carter nodded once, jaw tight, and stepped back into line. The column of boys began to move, boots on mud, cloth on cloth, sniffles, whispers. Lucas turned once, looking back at the crooked barn. It was still broken, still wounded, but for him, it had become the place where fear had died, and something terrifyingly gentle had taken its place. His final diary line from that march read, "The world is not what I was taught, the enemy is not who I was told, and kindness is the most frightening weapon of all, because once you feel it, you can never go back to believing the lies that once made you brave." The war ended, Germany surrendered. The boys went home, those who still had homes to return to. Some found ruins, some found silence, some found nothing at all. Lucas eventually made his way back to a city that barely resembled the one he'd left. Buildings were gutted husks, streets were cratered, the familiar bakery was a pile of bricks. His mother, miraculously, survived. When she opened the door and saw him standing there, thin but alive, she collapsed into his arms. "I thought you were dead," she sobbed. "They told us your unit was gone." Lucas held her tightly, the two wooden horses pressing into his ribs. He said just one sentence, "I met the enemy, and they saved me." Years passed. The world tried to move on. Lucas studied, he worked, he rebuilt. He never joined extremist groups. He avoided flags and slogans. Instead, he became a teacher. History, the subject that had almost killed him and then saved him. In his classroom, he never started with dates and battles. He started with questions. What were you told about people you've never met? Who benefits from your hatred? Who taught you who the enemy is? And eventually, when his students were ready, he told them about the barn, about the hunger, the fear, the propaganda. The American soldiers who were supposed to be monsters and who instead brought water, food, soap, and music. He told them about Sergeant Carter, though he never knew if that was the man's real name. He told them about the wooden horse. He held it up at the end of each school year. "This," he would say, "is proof. Proof that even when every structure around you screams for cruelty, mercy is still possible, and that one act of kindness can echo through a lifetime." Some of his students grew up to be teachers themselves. Some became doctors. Some became politicians. They carried his stories with them. Stories born in a barn that should have been a place of final surrender, but instead became a crossroads. A point where children learned that the enemy could also be human. Closing. The lesson. The barn is gone now. The wood rotted, the beams collapsed, the land repurposed. No plaque, no memorial, just soil that once held 200 frightened boys and a handful of American soldiers who made a choice. Not a choice about tactics, not about strategy, not even about victory. A choice about what kind of human beings they were going to be in the middle of a war designed to erase that question. 200 German boys expected death in that barn. They had been promised it, prepared for it, taught it. Instead, they received food, water, soap, music, and something they'd almost forgotten how to recognize: dignity. It didn't erase the crimes of the regime they fought for. It didn't erase the suffering of those harmed by that regime. But for those boys, it cracked the wall of lies they'd been raised inside. And through that crack, light came in. We talk about war as guns, tanks, maps, leaders pushing pieces on a board. But sometimes, the most important battles are fought in small, quiet places, in a collapsing barn, over a bowl of stew, with a bar of soap, with a carved wooden horse placed in a boy's hands by a man he was taught to hate. If there is a lesson in what happened there, it's this. Propaganda can teach us to hate strangers. War can pressure us to become monsters. But individual choices, small, human, stubborn choices, still matter. Sometimes the greatest victory is mercy, and sometimes the deepest shock is kindness. If this story moved you, remember it wasn't written in a studio. It was written in hunger, fear, confusion, and one impossible decision made by soldiers who chose to see the enemy as human beings. That choice changed 200 lives, and through those lives, it may yet change more. Because every time we remember this story, every time we choose understanding over blind hatred, we're adding our own echo to the mercy that started in that broken barn.